Chapter 1. Introduction. The Fascination of the Greek Gods. Imagine a time when the world was still full of secrets. A time when the sound of the sea was not only the sound of the waves, but the voice of the god Poseidon. In which a thunderstorm was not just a natural event, but Zeus himself, the ruler of heaven, shook the world with his lightning. In which love, beauty, war, revenge, hope, and death were not just feelings or states, but living deities who watched over people and fates. Greek mythology is one of the most fascinating narrative worlds of mankind. For over 2,500 years, their stories have captivated poets, artists, philosophers, and researchers. Whether in the epics of Homer, in the tragedies of the ancient theater, or in the temples and statues that we still marvel at today, the gods of Greece are omnipresent. But why do these myths fascinate us to this day? Perhaps because they are more than just old stories. They are a mirror of human longings and fears, of power and powerlessness, of love and loss. The Greeks used their myths to explain the world, nature, the origin of life, and at the same time they told about themselves. The birth of the gods, chaos and order. Before there were any humans at all, there was chaos in the imagination of the Greeks, a formless, limitless primordial state. Out of this chaos arose the first primordial forces, Gaia, the earth, Nyx, the night, Tartaros, the deep, and Eros, the love. Step by step, these forces formed an order from which the gods emerged. The first generations of the gods, the Titans, were giant, primordial beings who ruled heaven and earth. Kronos, one of the Titans, overthrew his own father Uranus, only to be overthrown later by his son Zeus. Even in this initial story, a motif is reflected that characterizes the Greek world of gods. Power is never eternal. It must always be won and defended anew. Mount Olympus, seat of the 12. After defeating his father Kronos and the Titans in the Titan battle, Zeus shared the world with his brothers and sisters. Zeus received the sky, Poseidon the sea, Hades the underworld. Together with other deities, they formed the pantheon of the so-called 12 Olympians, those gods who stood at the center of Greek religion and determined the fate of the world. In contrast to the unapproachable gods of other cultures, the Greek gods were surprisingly human. They loved and hated, they argued and plotted, they made mistakes, became jealous and moody. They were immortal, yes, but by no means infallible. It is precisely this mixture of divine power and human weakness that makes them so fascinating. Why the Greeks needed their gods? The world of antiquity was uncertain. Droughts, earthquakes, wars, and diseases could befall people at any time. In a time without modern science, the Greeks explained these phenomena through divine influences. When lightning struck, it was Zeus. When a ship sank, Poseidon was angry. If the harvest spoiled, perhaps Demeter, the goddess of fertility, had brought her wrath upon the people. But it wasn't just about fear. The gods also gave people hope, orientation, and role models. Aphrodite embodied love, Athena wisdom, Ares the passion of war. By sacrificing to the gods, building temples, or celebrating festivals, one felt integrated into a cosmic web of relationships. Influence to this day. Even though people have long since stopped believing in Zeus and Athena, the Greek gods have remained alive in literature, art, and pop culture. Whether in Shakespeare's dramas, in Renaissance paintings, in modern fantasy, or in films such as Percy Jackson or Wonder Woman, the old myths still inspire. They are timeless because they deal with eternal themes: power and betrayal, love and jealousy, heroism and hubris. Our journey through mythology. In this script, we will embark on a journey, not only through stories, but through a whole world. We will get to know the most important gods, their relationships, their conflicts, their importance for the Greeks and for us. We will see how they came into being, what myths surround them, how they were revered, and what traces they have left in our culture. To keep track of everything, we divide our journey into 20 chapters. Each chapter is dedicated to a specific aspect of the Greek gods, from the story of creation to the legacy of antiquity in our time. We want to see the gods not only as figures, but also as symbols. What does it mean when Athena stands for wisdom, but also for the art of war? Why is Hades not a devil, but a just, albeit sinister ruler? And what does the story of Prometheus tell us about the relationship between humans and gods? View. In the next chapter, we will go to the beginning of all things, to the primordial creation and the Titans. There we learn how chaos became order, how the first gods came into being, and how the battle of the generations paved the way for Zeus and the Olympians.
Chapter 2. The Primordial Creation and the Titans. In the beginning, there was chaos. This is how the ancient Greeks imagined it when they thought about where the world came from and how it all began. Chaos was not a yawning nothing, but an unformed, boundless primordial state, a surging something without order, without space, without time. Out of this chaos emerged the first primordial powers, which formed the foundation of the world. Gaia, the earth, the fertile mother who gave support to all beings. Nyx, the night, mysterious and unapproachable. Erebos, the darkness. Tartaros, the deep. And Eros, the unifying force of love that drew things together. Even in this first beginning, a thought is reflected that runs through the whole of Greek mythology. Everything arises from opposites, and everything lives from the play between chaos and order. Out of Gaia rose Uranus, the heavens, and with him began the drama of creation, which was more than just the creation of the world. It was also a story of power, desire, and violence. Uranus lay over Gaia night after night to embrace her, but at the same time he feared the children she bore. Titans were the name given to these first generations of gods, gigantic, elemental beings who inhabited heaven and earth. But Uranus hated her and wanted to keep her captive in the depths of Gaia. Thus a dull rumble grew in the earth itself, a suppressed anger that urged for liberation. It was Kronos, the youngest of the Titans, who finally mustered the courage to rise up against his father. With a sickle, which Gaia gave him, he ambushed Uranus as he bent down to the earth. In a brutal act, he emasculated him and threw away his bloody remains. From the blood that dripped to the earth arose the Irenaeus, the spirits of vengeance. And from the white foam that washed the sea rose Aphrodite, the goddess of love. Violence and beauty, revenge and seduction, both were born out of this first murder of the gods. But even Kronos could not enjoy power without fear. He ruled over heaven and earth, took his sister Rhea as his wife, and fathered the first generation of the new gods with her. But a prophecy warned him. A child of his own would overthrow him, just as he had overthrown his father. Driven by panic, he devoured every child Rhea bore. Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon all disappeared into his belly, trapped in a living dungeon. Rhea despaired, but when she gave birth to her youngest child, she made a plan with Gaia. She wrapped a stone in swaddling clothes and handed it over to the unsuspecting Kronos, who greedily swallowed it down. The child himself, Zeus, secretly brought her to the island of Crete, where he grew hidden in a cave, cared for by nymphs and protected by the Curetes, who drowned out the cry of the infant with a loud dance of arms. Zeus grew up, strong and clever, full of cunning and courage. When he grew up, he stood up to his father. With a potion prepared by the goddess Metis, he forced Kronos to spit out the devoured children again. So Zeus' siblings were freed, and together they rose up against the cruel Titan. A war broke out that shook the world, the Titan battle. For 10 years the battle raged between the Titans who had gathered under Kronos and the young gods who would later be called the Olympians. The earth shook, the sky burst, the sea surged as the forces of the two generations collided. Zeus looked for allies and found them in the Cyclops, the one-eyed giants who had been banished to Tartarus by Cronus. He freed them, and out of gratitude they forged the weapons that made him invincible, thunder and lightning. The Hecatonchires, the 100-armed giants, also joined him, and with their unbridled strength they hurled boulders at the Titans. Eventually, Zeus managed to overthrow Kronos and banish the Titans to the abyss of Tartarus, where they were guarded by the Hecatonchirons. The world was now free for a new rule, and Zeus took his father's place, but this time not alone. He shared power with his brothers and sisters. Poseidon received the sea, Hades the underworld, and Zeus himself the sky. This is how the order came into being, which the Greeks understood as a cosmic order, a balance that held the world together at its core. But this order was not final. Again and again, new threats arose. Gaia, in anger at the defeat of the Titans, gave birth to a last monster, Typhon, a massive being with 100 dragon heads that even put the gods to flight. But Zeus stood up to him, and after a mighty battle he hurled him under Mount Etna, where Typhon still rages and spews his fire into the world. With this, the rule of the Olympians was finally secured, and heaven henceforth belonged to Zeus and his family. The primordial creation and the struggle of the Titans show how the Greeks understood the world, as an eternal cycle of birth, rise, and fall, of order and chaos. No power was eternal. Every rule had to be won and defended. And yet, this battle created the basis for a new generation of gods that was closer to humans than the ancient Titans who ruled over elements and forces of nature. Zeus marked the beginning of a new era, the era of the Olympians, whose stories still fascinate us today. In the next chapter, we will dedicate ourselves to the rise of Zeus, his character, his role as ruler of heaven and father of the gods, and we will see how he shaped the world of the Greeks with cunning, power, and also with love.
Chapter 3. Zeus, ruler of heaven. After the battle of the Titans was decided, and Kronos and his brothers and sisters were banished to Tartarus, Zeus rose as the undisputed victor. He was not only the liberator of his brothers and sisters, but also the one who had elicited thunder, lightning, and the rumbling sky from the Cyclops. With these weapons, he was at the forefront of a new order that would shape the world of gods and humans alike. From then on, Zeus was the ruler of heaven, the father of gods and men, the guardian of justice, and the guardian of the order that held the cosmos together. But Zeus was more than just a strict ruler. He was a figure full of contradictions, who at the same time evoked awe and admiration, fear and closeness. His power was based on victory, but it was not a matter of course. Zeus knew that domination in the world of the gods was always endangered. That is why he established his authority not only by force, but also by clever alliances, by cunning, and by an inexhaustible vitality. He was not a god who sat enthroned in heaven at a distance, but one who intervened in the fate of the world, who fell in love, who watched jealously, and who responded with harsh punishments when he felt betrayed. He reflected all the ambivalence of divine power, magnanimous and protective on the one hand, angry and vengeful on the other. As the god of heaven, Zeus was inextricably linked to the forces of nature. When clouds came up, when thunder rumbled, when lightning flashed, people felt his presence. Heaven was his kingdom, the thunderbolts his weapon. No man, no god could resist him when he unleashed the wrath of lightning. But the Greeks saw him not only as a thunderstorm god, but also as the guardian of order. He was the one who supervised oaths, who protected contracts, who upheld the law. Anyone who broke an oath or violated the right of hospitality turned against Zeus himself. He was thus not only the ruler of nature, but also the moral guarantor of society. In a land where cities competed with each other and where political systems changed frequently, Zeus was the symbol of stability and justice, a divine bond that held people and peoples together. But as strictly as he watched over order and law, he was just as passionate in his personal life. Zeus' love stories are legendary, and they shape large parts of Greek mythology. Hardly a goddess, hardly a mortal remained untouched by his desire. In innumerable transformations, he approached the women who inflamed his heart. As a bull, he carried off Europa. As a swan, he won Leda. As a golden rain, he penetrated to Danaia. These connections gave rise to numerous heroes and demigods who populated the world of legends: Heracles, Perseus, Minos, Helena, and many more. In this way, Zeus was not only the ruler of heaven, but also the origin of an entire generation of heroes who carried the glory of the gods into the world of men. But his love also brought conflicts. Hera, his sister and wife, was not prepared to accept the constant infidelities in silence. Again and again, fights broke out between the two, which even shook Olympus. Hera sought to punish her husband's mistresses and children, and Zeus responded with punishments against Hera or with cunning to escape her. This eternal struggle between the two showed the Greeks that even on Olympus, marriage was not free of conflicts. It made the gods human, approachable, but at the same time sinister, because their wrath could shake the world. Zeus was not only insatiable in matters of love, but also a god who defended his power against any threat. After the Titans, another enemy arose, Typhon, a monster of gigantic proportions that had given birth to Gaia herself. When Typhon rose up against Olympus, many gods fled in the form of animals, but Zeus faced him. With thunder and lightning, he fought against the fire-breathing opponent until he banished him to Mount Etna, where he still rages. With this victory, Zeus showed that his rule was secured not only by cunning and diplomacy, but also by the sheer force of his divine weapons. In the eyes of the Greeks, Zeus was omnipresent. They felt it when a storm came up, when the sky shone clearly, when an oath was broken, or a hospitality ribbon was desecrated. In his honor, they built the greatest sanctuaries, including the famous Oracle of Dodona and, above all, Olympia, where the games in his honor were held every 4 years. People from all regions of Greece gathered there to show strength and courage in competition, as an offering to Zeus, who decided on victory and defeat. The statue of Zeus in Olympia, the work of Phidias, was considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world and made visible how much the Greeks revered the father of the gods. But for all their admiration, they also knew about his weaknesses. Zeus could be capricious, he could punish and blind jealousy, he could react cruelly when he felt betrayed. The story of Prometheus shows this clearly. Prometheus, who brought fire to the people, went against Zeus's will and brought hope and progress to mortals. Zeus, however, punished him cruelly by chaining him to a rock, where an eagle ate his liver every day. It was not until much later that Prometheus was freed. This story reflected the dark side of Zeus, who was not afraid to retaliate against rebellion with merciless harshness. Zeus was the epitome of divine power, but also a mirror of human contradictions. He was protector and tyrant, father and seducer, judge and avenger. It was precisely in this diversity that his greatness lay, for the Greeks did not see him as an unattainable abstract principle, but as a living force that permeated life in all its facets. Zeus was the center of Olympus, and without him, the world of the gods would not have been conceivable. In the next chapter, we turn to his wife Hera, the proud queen of Olympus, who stood at the side of the mighty Zeus, but was at the same time his bitter opponent. It reflected the power of marriage, the dignity of the goddesses, and the destructive power of jealousy.
Chapter 4. Hera, Queen of Olympus. If Zeus was the ruler of heaven, Hera was the queen of Olympus, and no other goddess had so much dignity, pride, and relentless strength as she did. As the sister and wife of Zeus, she stood by his side, but her life was marked by conflicts that arose from her husband's insatiability. Hera was the goddess of marriage, women, and childbirth, a protector of domestic life, and at the same time a bitter opponent of all those who dared to question her position. She embodied the power of order, but also the destructive power of jealousy, which could drag even the mightiest heroes into the abyss.
The Greeks saw in Hera a deity who radiated beauty and majesty. She was not only the wife of Zeus, but his equal partner, and in many myths she confronted him when he was too much guided by passion or whims. But this was precisely the tragedy of her figure. Zeus's insatiable desire for goddesses and mortals made Hera the victim again and again. While she guarded and kept the covenant of marriage, her husband was the one who broke it countless times. Hera did not react with silent tolerance, but with passionate anger, and her anger rarely hit Zeus himself, but mostly those women and children who emerged from his adventures. This is particularly evident in the fate of Hercules, the greatest of all heroes. Heracles was a son of Zeus and a mortal, and Hera pursued him from birth with merciless hatred. While still in the cradle, she sent 2 snakes to kill the child, but Heracles strangled her with his bare hands. Later, she had him driven mad, so that he killed his family in blind anger and had to repent through the famous 12 works. Heracles' whole life story was a struggle with the enmity of Hera, who detested him as a symbol of her husband's infidelity. This fierce persecution shows not only its severity, but also its unbridled power, for even demigods and heroes had not escaped its wrath. But Hera was more than just a jealous wife. She embodied the power of women in a world dominated by gods. As the goddess of marriage, she stood for fidelity and order, for the bond that held families together. She protected women during childbirth, watched over children, and was considered the patron saint of wives, who saw her as a divine ally. Many cities worshipped her with magnificent temples, especially Argos and Samos, where Hera was considered the supreme deity. Her places of worship were places of reverence, where she was worshipped not as the angry goddess of myths, but as a gracious ruler who watched over fertility and prosperity. At the same time, Hera was a goddess who interfered in the great conflicts of the world of the gods. In the Iliad, she appears as a powerful ally of the Greeks, full of cunning and fighting spirit. It was not uncommon for her to oppose Zeus himself, make plans to thwart his decisions, and seek alliances with other gods if she wanted to achieve her goals. Her pride did not allow her to step silently into the shadows, and so she became the voice of the goddesses, the embodiment of feminine strength in a world defined by her husband's thunder. Nevertheless, her history remained permeated by bitterness. Zeus's infidelity tested her time and time again, and she tried to save her pride by fighting the rivals who stood in her way. Leto, the mother of Apollo and Artemis, had to suffer from her torment when Hera made it difficult for her to give birth to the children. Io, a lover of Zeus, turned her into a cow and had her watched over by a 100-eyed guardian. Semele, the mother of Dionysus, was seduced by Hera's intrigues into seeing Zeus in his true form, which brought her death. These stories show Hera in her relentless anger, but also in a wounded dignity that knew no other way to defend herself than to destroy her rivals. It was precisely this mixture of dignity and cruelty that fascinated Hera. She was not only the guardian of the marriage covenant, but also the one who embodied the pain of infidelity. Their jealousy made them human, their power made them terrible. She was a queen who was not willing to hide behind Zeus, and whose voice and actions shook Olympus again and again. The Greeks revered her, feared her, admired her, and they recognized in her the dark truth that even in the marriage of the gods was no eternal peace. As Queen of Olympus, Hera stood for an order that was challenged again and again, but never broken. She was the constant at the side of the volatile Zeus, the unshakable ruler who defended her position with an iron will. Her story shows that power lies not only in thunder and lightning, but also in dignity, steadfastness, and unyielding pride. Hera was more than just the woman at Zeus' side. She was the heart of Olympus, and without her, the world of the gods would be unthinkable.
In the next chapter, we turn to Poseidon, the brother of Zeus, who ruled the seas with his trident and whose whims could unleash storms that taught even the strongest sailors to fear.
Chapter 5. Poseidon, Lord of the Seas. Among the brothers who divided the world among themselves after the fall of Cronus, Poseidon received the sea. While Zeus ruled the sky and Hades ruled the underworld, Poseidon became the god of all oceans, rivers, and springs, the ruler of storms and waves, the shaking of the earth. With his mighty trident, he could pile up wave crests, unleash storms, and even make the land tremble. For the Greeks, a people of sailors, traders, and colonists, Poseidon was one of the most important deities, because the success of every voyage depended on his favor, and his wrath could drag even the strongest ship into the depths. Poseidon was a powerful figure, fierce, impetuous, and full of energy. His nature reflected the nature of the sea itself, sometimes calm and mirror-smooth, sometimes unpredictable and raging. Unlike Zeus, who was able to maintain a certain distance during his rule, Poseidon was more immediate, physical, and capricious. Sailors feared his escapes, but they also sought his favor through sacrifices and prayers before setting out for uncharted waters. A bull driven into the sea was considered the highest sacrifice for him, because the bull stood for strength and ferocity, qualities that also distinguished Poseidon. In many myths, Poseidon appears as a rival of his brother Zeus. Although he was subordinate to him, he tried several times to seize power. Once Poseidon, Hera, and Athena conspired against Zeus, even bound him to overthrow him. But Thetis, the goddess of the sea, called on the 100-armed monster Briareus, who freed Zeus, and the rebels had to admit defeat. This episode shows that Poseidon was not only the brother, but also the constant opponent of the sky god. His urge for independence was reflected in the restless movement of the sea, which could never be completely tamed. But Poseidon feuded not only against Zeus, but also against other gods. His dispute with Athena over the rule of the city of Athens is particularly famous. Both gods stepped before the people to give a gift that would decide the future of the city. Poseidon thrust his trident into the rock of the Acropolis, and a salty spring gushed forth, a symbol of naval power and strength. Athena, however, gave the olive tree, a sign of peace, food, and prosperity. The Athenians chose Athena, and so she became the patron goddess of the city. Poseidon, however, felt this defeat as a deep insult and remained hostile to the inhabitants of Athens. This story shows his pride, but also his impatience, which often led him into conflicts in which he could not always assert himself. His relationships with people were as varied as the nature he embodied. He could be a protector when he sent favorable winds to the sailors, but he could also drive them to destruction. In Homer's Odyssey, Poseidon appears as the bitter opponent of Odysseus, who lets the hero wander the seas for years because he had blinded his son Polyphemus, the Cyclops. Poseidon pursued Odysseus relentlessly, piling up waves, letting storms rage, and making every return home a dangerous adventure. It was only after many years, when the other gods stood up for Odysseus, that Poseidon gave up his vindictiveness. This story shows the dark side of the sea god, who did not forget any insult and could be merciless in his anger. But Poseidon was not only a god of destruction, he was also considered the creator, builder, and sustainer of the world. Many myths tell that he used his trident to spring springs, redirect rivers, and raise islands from the sea. The horses were also attributed to him, an unusual but fascinating attribute. The Greeks saw in the tremendous power of the galloping horses a reflection of the waves of the sea, which rush inexorably. Poseidon himself is said to have created the first horse, and in many depictions he appears as a charioteer chasing over the waves with a team of foaming horses. In this combination of sea and horse, it becomes clear how much Poseidon stood for untamed power and movement. His love stories were hardly less numerous than those of his brother Zeus. Poseidon associated himself with goddesses, nymphs, and mortals, and from these connections emerged numerous figures who populated the world of legends. Triton, the sea god with the conch shell, was his son, as was Theseus, the hero of Athens who defeated the Minotaur. Massive monsters such as the sea monster that once threatened Andromeda were also considered children of Poseidon. This diversity reveals his role as the origin and father of many beings who oscillated between divinity and savagery. Poseidon played a special role in the worship of the Greeks. Coastal cities, ports, and islands built temples for him, sacrificial altars stood on beaches, and sailors called to him before they set foot on the open sea. Especially on the Isthmus of Corinth, he was honored with magnificent games, which were dedicated to him in a similar way to Zeus's Olympic Games. There he was shown to be connected to horses and competitions. There he was honored as the god of movement and strength. His importance for the daily life of the Greeks was immense because trade, travel, and military campaigns on the sea were hardly conceivable without his favor. Poseidon was the god who was at once terrible and life-giving, a god who embodies wrath and mercy in equal measure. His nature reflected the untamed power of the sea, which gave people food but could also bring death. Creative and destructive forces were combined in him, and perhaps it was precisely this ambiguity that made him one of the most fascinating figures in the Greek pantheon. He was the lord of the seas, the shaker of the earth, a brother of Zeus, an eternal rival, and at the same time a god whose voice the Greeks heard in every storm. In the next chapter, we turn to Hades, the gloomy ruler of the underworld, whose kingdom was not heaven or sea, but the shadows of death, and yet he was far more than just the god of the end.
Chapter 6. Hades, Lord of the Underworld. While Zeus ruled the sky and Poseidon the sea, Hades ruled the realm of the underworld. It was not a place of triumph and joy, but of silence, shadows, and the end. But it was precisely because he ruled over death that Hades occupied a central position in the Greek imagination. He was not the enemy of life, but the one who kept the balance, who saw to it that every soul found its place and that the order of the cosmos was maintained even beyond the boundary of life. Unlike later in the Christian tradition, he was not seen as a devil or demon, but as a righteous, albeit relentless ruler who led a kingdom into which every human being inevitably had to enter. The Greeks feared Hades, but they did not hate him. His name was rarely spoken. He was preferred to be called Pluton, the Rich One, because it was he who possessed the treasures of the earth, the metals, the minerals, and the fertility that sprouted from the ground. Even though he himself rarely appeared on the surface, his power was felt in every grain, in every stone, in every hidden treasure. His kingdom lay deep underground, separated from the world of the living by rivers such as Styx, Acheron, and Lethe. There Hermes Psychopompos led the souls, and there guards like the three-headed dog Cerberus watched over that no dead escaped and no living entered without authorization. Hades was not a god of seduction or whimsy, but a strict, sober ruler. But his story was also overshadowed by a great myth that put him in a different light, the abduction of Persephone. Persephone, the daughter of Demeter, was young, beautiful, and full of life. As she was picking flowers in a meadow, the earth opened, and Hades rose in his black chariot, dragged her into the underworld, and made her his wife. This act of violence shook the world of the gods. Demeter desperately searched for her daughter, and as long as Persephone was gone, she let the earth wither, fields dry up, and people starve. Only a compromise brought the balance back. Persephone was allowed to spend part of the year with her mother on earth, but since she had eaten the pomegranate in the underworld, she was forever connected to Hades. This is how the cycle of the seasons came into being. Spring and summer when Persephone is with Demeter, autumn and winter when she returns to Hades. In this story, Hades appears as a god who takes what he desires, but also as part of an order that combines life and death, prosperity and decay.
Although Hades was not an Olympian, his importance was immeasurable. Every man, whether king or beggar, hero or slave, had to enter his kingdom. There, the souls were judged and rewarded or punished according to their lives. The asphodel meadows were the place of ordinary souls, the Elysian realms a paradise for heroes and the righteous, while sinners suffered torment in the depths of Tartarus. Hades himself seldom interfered in these judgments. He was rather the supreme guardian of the empire, who ensured order, while others such as Minos or Rhadamanthys took over the actual judging. This distance gave him a special greatness. He was not cruel for the sake of cruelty, but incorruptible and just in the administration of his empire. Despite his severity, Hades was not a joyless god. With Persephone at his side, he had a companion who filled him with light. She brought a breath of life to the shadows, and her presence made him more than just the ruler of the dead. In some depictions, he appears with her at his side, a quiet but harmonious couple, united not by passion, but by an inescapable bond. Thus, Hades was not only seen as the god of the end, but also as part of a cycle that produced new life again and again. The Greeks avoided his name, but they honored him with sacrifices. Black animals, mostly rams, were consecrated to him, and they were offered in pits to be sent directly to his kingdom. His presence was less visible than that of his brethren, but it was omnipresent, in every grave, in every harvest, in every wealth that came out of the earth. Hades stood for the inescapable truth that life and death are inextricably linked, that no growth is possible. He was a reminder to the people, reminding them that even kings are mortal. In his incorruptible severity, there was also a consolation. Before him, everyone was equal. Unlike Zeus, who had his favorites, or Poseidon, who wavered in anger and favor, Hades treated all souls with the same justice. This neutrality made him terrible, but also honorable. Hades was not a god who shaped many adventures or intrigues, and perhaps that is why he is so haunting. He is the silent brother who works in the shadows, whose kingdom forms the basis for life itself, because it secures the cycle of becoming and passing away. Without him, the world would not be complete, and without his order, the universe would have sunk into chaos. In the next chapter, we will devote ourselves to another central figure, Demeter, the goddess of fertility whose love for her daughter Persephone determined not only the course of the year, but life itself. Chapter 7. Demeter, goddess of fertility. Demeter was the goddess of the earth, fertility, and the ripe harvest, and no other deity embodied the life-giving power of nature for the Greeks as impressively as she did. While Zeus ruled with thunder and lightning, and Poseidon whipped up the waves, Demeter was the one who gave people food, sprouted the seeds, and oversaw the cycle of growth and harvest. Without their favor, the fields withered. Without their care, the earth remained barren and empty. She was the mother of the fields, the protector of the peasants, a goddess who was closer to man than to the mighty rulers of Olympus, because she directly determined daily life. But Demeter's story was also marked by a deep tragedy that changed its nature forever. It all began with the kidnapping of her daughter Persephone by Hades. Persephone was not just a child for Demeter, but the heart of her life, a symbol of innocence and hope. When Hades abducted her to the underworld, Demeter fell into despair. She roamed the earth, searched for her daughter with burning torches, turned to gods and men, but no one could take away her pain. During this search, she neglected her divine task. The fields withered, the seeds did not germinate, famine spread. The whole world stood still, because without Demeter, there was no life. The gods urged Zeus to do something, because even he couldn't stand by and watch humanity perish. Finally, a compromise was reached. Persephone was to stay with her mother for part of the year. But because she had eaten the seeds of a pomegranate in the underworld, she was forever bound to Hades. This is how the change of seasons came about. When Persephone returned to Demeter, nature awoke to new life. Flowers bloomed, fields greened, the earth bore fruit. But when she returned to the underworld, Demeter fell into mourning, and the earth became barren. The days shorter, winter set in. The Greeks saw this myth not only as an explanation for the course of the year, but also as a symbol for the connection between life and death, joy and loss. Demeter was a loving but also strict goddess. She gave people the knowledge of agriculture and agriculture. She showed them how to sow seeds, how to bring in the harvest, how to build up supplies. But at the same time, she demanded respect. Anyone who disregarded her gifts or neglected her cult could be severely punished. It is said that she transformed the sons of a king because they mocked her when she asked for water when she was exhausted. There was life in their devotion, death in their anger. Demeter was particularly closely associated with the mysteries of Eleusis, one of the most important religious cults of antiquity. There, the secrets of life, death, and rebirth were celebrated in secret ceremonies, and Demeter was at the center of these rituals. Those who participated in the Eleusinian mysteries believed that they were gaining a deeper understanding of the fate of the soul and the hope of a better life after death. These mysteries shaped the religious life of Greece for centuries and showed how much Demeter was connected to the deepest need of the people for meaning and comfort. Her depiction was that of a mature, maternal woman, often with ears of corn or a cornucopia in her hand. She was not a youthful beauty like Aphrodite, not a martial figure like Athena, but a goddess who embodied maturity, care, and fertility. Her dignity lay not in power games or intrigues, but in the quiet certainty that all life depends on her hand. Perhaps this is what made her so important to the Greeks. She was not unapproachable, but a constant companion whose affection and grief were immediately noticeable. Demeter reminded people that life is a cycle, that every seed must die in order to grow anew, that every harvest also brings winter with it. In her connection with Persephone lay the hope that every loss would be followed by a new beginning. She was a goddess who brought comfort and pain in equal measure, who showed people that suffering and joy are inextricably linked. Demeter was thus at the center of everyday life like hardly any other deity. Their power was not spectacular like the lightning of Zeus or the storms of Poseidon, but silent but all-encompassing. She kept the earth alive, she fed the people, she taught them patience and gratitude. In it, the Greeks recognized the maternal power of nature, which sustains all life and yet makes it transient. In the next chapter, we turn to Hestia, the goddess of hearthfire, who is one of the lesser-known Olympians, but nevertheless played a silent and indispensable role in the daily life of the Greeks.
Chapter 8. Hestia, goddess of hearth-fire. Among the Olympian gods, Hestia plays a quiet but indispensable role. She was the goddess of the hearth-fire, the house, and the family. A protector of order who stood out less for power or intrigue than for consistency and reliability. In a world where gods were often marked by passions, struggles, and jealousy, Hestia embodied calm and peace. She was the firstborn of the children of Cronus, and at the same time, the one who had the least share in the great myths and battles. But it was precisely her quiet presence that made her one of the most important goddesses in the life of the Greeks. The hearth fire that Hestia embodied was more than just warmth and light for the people. It was the center of the house, the place where the family gathered, where meals were prepared, where sacrifices were offered and prayers were said. Without the fire, no life was possible, and so Hestia was considered the guardian of everyday life. Every house had its consecrated fire, and whoever founded a new home brought a flame from the hearth of the parents' house with them to maintain the connection. In this way, Hestia was present in every household, silent but unshakable. It also played a role in public order. In the cities of Greece, an eternal fire burned in the prytanes, the town halls, which was dedicated to Hestia. It was the symbol of community life, and when colonies were established, a flame was taken from this sacred fire to be lit in the new city.
In this way, Hestia connected not only the families, but also the polis. It was a bond between the past and the future, between home and a new beginning. Although she was counted among the 12 Olympians, Hestia did not appear in the great stories. She took no part in the intrigues between Zeus and Hera. She did not fight for glory and war like Athena or Ares. She did not seduce like Aphrodite. Their strength lay in their restraint. While other gods displayed their power with splendor, Hestia maintained her dignity through silence. She was the one who refused to get involved in strife, who put peace over battle, and who countered the chaos of the world of the gods with a firm order. Her purity was also reflected in her virginity. Like Athena and Artemis, Hestia swore never to take a husband. She remained unmarried, not out of aversion, but out of devotion to her task. This set her apart from the other goddesses, who were woven into countless stories through their connections with gods and humans. Hestia, however, was untouched by the storms of passion. She was the embodiment of calm, purity, and constancy, a deity who showed people that true strength does not always lie in struggle and conquest, but in steadfastness and devotion. Her cult was widespread, and she was among the first deities to be invoked in each sacrifice. No meal, no feast began without a libation to Hestia, for she was considered the one who strengthened the bond between gods and men. Whoever honored Hestia also honored the foundation of life itself, for she was the invisible force that held everything together. Perhaps it is precisely her silence that makes Hestia so fascinating. In a world full of loud, combative, and passionate gods, she was the antithesis. It was the warmth in the heart of the house, the light in the darkness, the constancy in the midst of change. She did not step forward, but without her, life would have been unthinkable. In it, the Greeks recognized that it is not always the loud deeds that show greatness, but often the quiet, inconspicuous forces that form the basis of existence. Hestia was the goddess who did not appear in the storm, but in the quiet glow of the flame. She was the one who lived in every house, watched in every city, and was honored in every sacrifice. Perhaps that is why she was one of the most enduring and reliable figures in the Greek pantheon, a symbol of peace and order that even the power games of Olympus could not shake. In the next chapter, we turn to Athena, the goddess of wisdom and strategy, who was born in shining armor and was to become one of the most important patron goddesses of the Greeks.
Chapter 9. Athena, Goddess of Wisdom. Athena was one of the most radiant figures in the Greek pantheon. She was the goddess of wisdom, prudence, and strategy, but also a warlike goddess who stood up for order and justice in the struggle. In contrast to Ares, who embodied the wild, bloody war, Athena stood for the clear mind, for planning, for tactical skill, and for the victory that is achieved through discipline and reason. Her birth itself was an event of extraordinary symbolic power, which made her a unique figure from the very beginning. When Zeus learned that one of his lovers, the goddess Metis, was carrying a child, he feared the prophecy that this child could become more powerful than himself. To prevent this, he devoured Metis and the unborn child. But after some time, Zeus suffered from severe pain in his head. In his agony, he sent for Hephaestus, who split his skull with an axe, and out of this wound sprang Athena, grown up, in shining armor, armed with spear and shield. She was thus not only a daughter of Zeus, but also a part of his spirit, born of his head, symbol of pure reason and divine wisdom. From the very beginning, Athena was the protector of cities, the goddess of civilization and the arts. It taught people handicrafts, weaving, and pottery. It stood for the progress and development that led human life from the wilderness to the order of the polis. But at the same time, she was a fighter, a goddess in armor who was always ready to defend order. In her, thought and action, spirit and action were combined in a way that made her one of the most revered goddesses. Its importance is particularly evident in the myth of the city of Athens. Together with Poseidon, she fought for the patronage of the city, and both offered the people a gift. Poseidon let a spring spring, but its water was salty and not suitable for drinking.
Athena, however, gave the olive tree, a symbol of peace, food, and prosperity. The people chose Athena, and so she became the patron goddess of the city, which henceforth bore her name. The olive tree remained a sacred symbol of Athens, and the goddess was considered the embodiment of the values that made the city a stronghold of culture, philosophy, and art. Athena was a virgin goddess who never married and maintained her independence. It was pure, untouched by the passions that drove Zeus, Poseidon, or Aphrodite. This purity gave her a special dignity and made her an incorruptible guardian of justice. However, her close bond with heroes like Odysseus shows that she was not unapproachable. Rather, she was a companion who helped to overcome dangers through wise advice. Odysseus owed his return home to her, for she guided him through countless trials with cunning and intellect. The Greeks saw in her the ideal of a wise counselor who stood by the side of people when they used their minds. Their most famous attribute was the shield, the aegis, on which the head of Medusa was emblazoned, which terrified any enemy. Perseus had given this head to her after she had supported him in his adventure. Thus, Athena embodied not only wisdom, but also the power to spread fear when necessary. She was not soft, but steadfast, a goddess who inspired and commanded respect at the same time. Athena played a special role in the arts and philosophy. It stood for reason, for clear thinking, which formed the basis of Greek culture. Philosophers and poets saw in her a divine embodiment of the human striving for knowledge. In Athens itself, she was honored with great festivals, the Panathenaic days, where competitions, processions, and sacrifices took place in her honor. The Parthenon, her massive temple on the Acropolis, was one of the largest buildings of antiquity and a visible sign of the veneration she was revered. Athena was, in many respects, the ideal of the Greeks. It combined strength and wisdom, courage and prudence, the art of war and the love of peace. She was not a goddess who worked in secret, but one who visibly steered the fate, a patroness who brought order where chaos threatened. But Athena could also be unyielding. Whoever violated their purity or profaned their sanctuaries had to fear their wrath. The myth of Medusa is an example of this. Medusa was once a beautiful woman, but when she was seduced or raped by Poseidon in the temple of Athena, Athena turned her into a monster with snake hair that turned anyone who looked at her to stone. This cruelty shows a darker side of Athena, who made it clear that her purity and dignity were inviolable. However, her close bond with heroes like Odysseus shows that she was not unapproachable. Rather, she was a companion who helped to overcome dangers through wise advice. Odysseus owed his return home to her, for she guided him through countless trials with cunning and intellect. The Greeks saw in her the ideal of a wise counselor who stood by the side of people when they used their minds. Their most famous attribute was the shield, the aegis, on which the head of Medusa was emblazoned, which terrified any enemy. Perseus had given this head to her after she had supported him in his adventure. Thus, Athena embodied not only wisdom, but also the power to spread fear when necessary. She was not soft, but steadfast, a goddess who inspired and commanded respect at the same time. Athena played a special role in the arts and philosophy. It stood for reason, for clear thinking, which formed the basis of Greek culture. Philosophers and poets saw in her a divine embodiment of the human striving for knowledge. In Athens itself, she was honored with great festivals, the Panathenaic days, where competitions, processions, and sacrifices took place in her honor. The Parthenon, her massive temple on the Acropolis, was one of the largest buildings of antiquity and a visible sign of the veneration she was revered. Athena was, in many respects, the ideal of the Greeks. It combined strength and wisdom, courage and prudence, the art of war, and the love of peace. She was not a goddess who worked in secret, but one who visibly steered the fate, a patroness who brought order where chaos threatened. But Athena could also be unyielding. Whoever violated their purity or profaned their sanctuaries had to fear their wrath. The myth of Medusa is an example of this. Medusa was once a beautiful woman, but when she was seduced or raped by Poseidon in the temple of Athena, Athena turned her into a monster with snake hair that turned anyone who looked at her to stone. This cruelty shows a darker side of Athena, who made it clear that her purity and dignity were inviolable. Thus, Athena was a goddess who worked far beyond the boundaries of mythology. It was the symbol of the forces that shaped Greek culture: intelligence, strategy, inventiveness, and at the same time the ability to defend oneself. She was the one who showed that true power does not lie in brute force, but in clear thinking and clever action. In the next chapter, we turn to Ares, the god of savage war, who in many ways embodied the opposite of Athena and yet was an indispensable part of the world of the gods.
Chapter 10. Ares, God of War. Ares was the god of war, but unlike Athena, who stood for strategy, clever planning, and orderly action, he embodied the raw, impetuous violence of the battlefield. It was the thunder of battle, the crack of weapons, the cry of the dying, the blazing fire of destruction. While Athena understood war as a necessary means of maintaining order, Ares was the embodiment of chaos and untamed passion. He was feared, but not highly revered, because the Greeks themselves saw war as a necessity, but not an ideal. And so Ares was a god whose name evoked terror, but whose figure did not arouse love. In myths, Ares often appears as powerful, but at the same time unrestrained and irascible. He threw himself into battles without thinking, was guided by anger and bloodlust, and bore defeat with difficulty. He was often mocked by other gods, even by his father Zeus, who despised him because he waged war not out of justice, but out of a desire for destruction. This contempt made Ares an ambivalent figure who had power but rarely enjoyed respect. Nevertheless, Ares was inextricably linked to human life because war was a constant reality of antiquity. In every battle, in every scream on the battlefield, in every drop of blood that seeped into the earth, Ares was present. He was what people feared and at the same time could not avoid. Where Athena symbolized the victory of reason, Ares stood for the horror that war inevitably brought with it. His love life was as passionate and stormy as his way of fighting. His connection to Aphrodite, the goddess of love, is famous. While Aphrodite was married to Hephaestus, she was always drawn to Ares, who was the wild, impetuous counterpart to her delicate beauty. This affair was exposed in one of Olympus's most famous stories. Hephaestus spun an invisible net in which he caught Ares and Aphrodite during their night of love and summoned the gods to taunt them. The scene showed the ridiculousness associated with Ares and made it clear that while his power was great, his prestige was small. Despite his weaknesses, Ares played a significant role in the tales of heroes. Many legends describe how he himself intervened in battles, for example in the Trojan War, where he first supported the Trojans but then switched to the side of the Greeks. In Homer's Iliad, he appears as a huge figure, but Athena confronts him and wounds him severely. This defeat was not just an episode of the epic, but a symbolic representation. The clear, strategic spirit triumphs over blind violence. The children of Ares often reflected his wild nature. With Aphrodite, he had Harmonia, the goddess of concord, but also Deimos and Phobos, the embodiments of terror and fear, who always appeared at his side on the battlefield. Wherever Ares fought, terror and fear were never far away, and people felt that his presence made war not a heroic act, but a bloody nightmare. His cult was less common than that of other Olympians, but he had his places of worship. In Sparta, where war was part of life and education, he was particularly honored. There, Ares was not a despised god, but a symbol of strength and irrepressible courage. He was also worshipped in Thebes, but overall he remained a god who was feared more than he was loved. His shrines were places of warning, not hope. Ares was a figure full of contradictions, powerful but mocked, indispensable but unloved, feared and yet despised.
His cult was less common than that of other Olympians, but he had his places of worship. In Sparta, where war was part of life and education, he was particularly honored. There, Ares was not a despised god, but a symbol of strength and irrepressible courage. He was also worshipped in Thebes, but overall he remained a god who was feared more than he was loved. His shrines were places of warning, not hope. Ares was a figure full of contradictions, powerful but mocked, indispensable, unloved, feared, and yet despised. He embodied the dark side of war, the lust for violence and destruction that threatened any order. For the Greeks, it was a mirror of reality. War was inevitable, full of pain and blood, and yet there was no escaping it. In this role, Ares remained immortal, a reminder that people always return to the same cycle of violence. In the next chapter, we turn to Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, who in many ways was the counterpart to Ares and whose power was not based on weapons, but on seduction and longing. Chapter 11. Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty. Aphrodite was the goddess of love, beauty, and seduction, one of the most powerful and at the same time most mysterious figures in Greek mythology. While other gods asserted their rule with thunder, weapons, or cunning, a smile, a look, a gesture was enough for Aphrodite to captivate the hearts of men and even the gods. Their power was invisible but all-encompassing. It could drive heroes into the madness of desire, plunge kings into wars, and even entangle the eternal gods in a web of longing. Nothing escaped their influence, for love and desire are forces that touch everyone, mortals or immortals. Its origin itself was surrounded by mythical violence. One of the most famous versions tells that she was born from the foam of the sea when Kronos threw the genitals of his father Uranus into the sea. Out of the white foam rose Aphrodite, beautiful and radiant, and the winds carried her on a shell to the coast of Cyprus. There she was received and adorned by the Horon, the goddesses of the seasons, before she entered the community of the gods. This image of those born from the sea, eternally young and immaculately beautiful, became one of the most powerful symbols of antiquity and continues to have an impact on Renaissance art and beyond. Aphrodite embodied more than just physical beauty. It was the symbol of irresistible attraction, the force that holds the world together, brings people together, and renews life itself. There was happiness in her smile, but also danger, because her power could destroy as well as create. It was often she who sowed discord by seducing hearts, breaking alliances, or plunging heroes into hopeless adventures. But it also gave joy, union, and the sweetness of love, without which life would have been empty. Her role in the judgment of Paris is famous. When the Trojan prince was asked to decide which of the three goddesses, Hera, Athena, or Aphrodite, was the most beautiful, each promised him a gift. Hera offered power, Athena offered wisdom and victory in war, but Aphrodite promised him the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris chose Aphrodite, and so he got Helena, the queen of Sparta, as his wife. But this decision led to the outbreak of the Trojan War, which plunged an entire generation of heroes into ruin. Thus, in this story, the double nature of Aphrodite is revealed. She gave love, but love brought suffering and bloodshed. Her connection to Ares, the god of war, was one of the most famous love stories of antiquity. While she was married to the blacksmith god Hephaestus, she was always drawn to Ares, whose impetuous passion was the counterpart to her own art of seduction. This connection reflected the close link between love and war, between passion and destruction. Because where love ignites, jealousy, quarrels, and fights often follow. Aphrodite and Ares had children who symbolically continued this union. Phobos and Deimos, terror and fear, accompanied Ares to the battlefield, while Harmonia, the concord, emerged from this union. But Aphrodite was not only the goddess of desire. She was also a protector, a goddess who watched over couples, marriages, and the bond of affection. In Kythera, and especially in Cyprus, where she had risen from the sea, she was venerated with magnificent festivals. Their sanctuaries were places of beauty and joy, but also of secret mysteries that honored the mystery of love and fertility. Their power extended over land and sea, and even great heroes like Anchises or Adonis could not escape their spell. The story of Adonis shows the deeper side of Aphrodite. Adonis was a handsome young man whom she loved, but he was mortally wounded by a boar. Out of her grief grew a flower, the Adonis rose, a symbol of the transience of beauty and the fleeting nature of love. Here, Aphrodite reveals herself not only as the goddess of seduction, but also as a being who knows pain and loss. It was not only the source of joy, but also the reminder that even the greatest beauty is fragile. In many depictions, Aphrodite appears as an eternally young woman, surrounded by charities and horin, by doves and roses, symbols of love and life. She was not the fierce goddess with weapons, but the ruler with an invisible spell that was stronger than any armor. Her power lay not in violence, but in longing, and in that she was invincible. Aphrodite reminded the Greeks that life without love is lifeless, that beauty and attraction are forces that move the world at its core. But at the same time, it was a warning symbol that love does not always bring peace, but often also discord, pain, and war. She was the goddess who made people smile, but also to cry, a figure who inseparably linked joy and sorrow. In the next chapter, we turn to Hermes, the nimble messenger of the gods, who walked between heaven, earth, and the underworld, and who was not only a messenger, but also the god of merchants, travelers, and thieves.
Chapter 12. Hermes, messenger of the gods and trickster. Hermes was the nimble messenger of the gods who walked between heaven, earth, and the underworld, a god who had so many faces that he played a unique role in Greek mythology. He was the messenger of Zeus, the bearer of divine commands, but at the same time, he was the god of travelers, merchants, shepherds, and thieves. He combined cunning and speed, sagacity and cunning. He was a mediator, a wanderer between worlds who knew how to cross borders, and whose wit and agility made him one of the most fascinating figures in the pantheon. Hermes was the son of Zeus and Maia, one of the Pleiades. As soon as he was born, he unfolded his cunning character. On the same day, he stole the cattle of his half-brother Apollo, covered their tracks by making them walk backwards, and at the same time invented the lyre, a musical instrument that he built from a turtle. When Apollo discovered the theft, he confronted Hermes, but the little god spoke so eloquently that even the offended Apollo had to laugh. Finally, Hermes gave him the lyre as compensation, and rivalry turned into friendship. This myth already shows what Hermes was all about. He was mischievous, agile, a master of words and deception, and yet endearing enough to emerge unscathed from any cunning. As a messenger of the gods, Hermes was tirelessly on the road. With his winged sandals, which allowed him to fly faster than any wind, he brought messages to the gods and carried out orders. His staff, the Kerachaion, entwined with two serpents, was the symbol of his role as mediator and peacemaker. He was the only one who could move between heaven, earth, and the underworld without fear. Hermes accompanied the souls of the deceased into the realm of Hades and thus received the nickname Psychopompos, spiritual guide. This task made him a figure associated not only with life and movement, but also with the transition to the silence of death. However, Hermes was not only the messenger, but also the god of trade and ways. Merchants and travelers revered him because he could bring good luck, but also because he symbolized cunning and ingenuity, qualities that were just as necessary in trade as they were on long journeys. At crossroads stood small stone pillars, the so-called Hermes, which bore his name and were dedicated to him. They were considered a protective sign for travelers, but also a sign that Hermes was present wherever paths crossed and decisions had to be made. His role as the god of thieves and crooks shows his ambivalent nature. He was not evil, but cunning, a trickster who overcame obstacles with cunning and eloquence. The Greeks saw in him the embodiment of those qualities that could be dangerous, but also aroused admiration.
Anyone who thought quickly, spoke skillfully, and mastered every situation with wit was under Hermes' protection. He was a god who showed people that not only brute force or divine power leads to success, but also intelligence, cunning, and agility. Hermes also appeared as a helper of many heroes. Perseus, for example, received from him the winged sandals that enabled him to obtain the head of Medusa. Odysseus also owed him salvation when Hermes gave him the herb Mali, which protected him from the magic arts of the Kirki. In such stories, Hermes does not appear as a warrior or judge, but as a savior and companion who gave decisive help with his cleverness and agility. His connection to music and art showed another facet. With the invention of the lyre, he had given Apollo an instrument that became the voice of poetry and music. Hermes' nature is also reflected in this. He was not only a god of cunning, but also of creativity, an inventor who opened up new paths for mankind. In the depiction, Hermes usually appears as a youthful, slender god with wings on his sandals and helmet, with a staff in his hand and a smile that reflects his liveliness. He was not a fearsome god, but one who radiated closeness, agile, cheerful, and full of movement. For the Greeks, he was a companion on journeys, a patron god of the paths, a messenger who was present wherever borders were crossed, be it from place to place, from person to person, or from life to death. Hermes was thus a figure full of contrasts, an honest messenger and a cunning thief, a companion of the dead and a symbol of life force, a god of order and play with her. His greatness lay in his agility, and perhaps for this very reason he was one of the most popular gods, because he showed people that cunning and spirit are just as important as strength and violence. In the next chapter, we turn to Artemis, the virgin huntress who was worshipped as the goddess of the forest, animals, and the moon, and whose strict purity made her as fascinating as it was terrible.
Chapter 13. Artemis, goddess of the hunt and the moon. Artemis was the virgin huntress, the goddess of forests, wild animals, and the moon. She was a daughter of Zeus and the Titan Leto, and the twin sister of Apollo. From her birth, she was a figure full of contrasts. She stood for purity and independence, but at the same time for the untamed power of nature. Artemis was a goddess who did not allow herself to be bound by any passion, who put her freedom above all else, and who could bring both protection and destruction with her bow and arrows. Her birth was marked by suffering. When Leto became pregnant, Hera pursued her with jealousy, as she could not bear the infidelity of her husband Zeus. No country wanted to give the Leto refuge, until finally the floating island of Delos offered her protection. There she gave birth to Artemis, who immediately stood by her mother's side and facilitated the birth of her twin brother Apollo. From the very beginning, it was clear that Artemis was not only the hunter and mistress of the wilderness, but also a protector of women and women giving birth. This double role, as a helper during childbirth and as a strict virgin goddess, shaped her figure for all time. Artemis was inextricably linked to the wilderness. She wandered through forests and mountains, accompanied by a band of nymphs who, like her, preserved virginity. With bow and quiver, she hunted deer and wild beasts, and her movements were as swift and silent as the wind. For the Greeks, she was the embodiment of untamed nature, beautiful and free, but also unapproachable and dangerous. Anyone who violated their purity or disregarded their laws had to fear their deadly wrath. Many myths tell of the severity of Artemis. The hunter Actaeon, for example, saw her by chance while she was bathing with her nymphs. But the goddess, who put her purity above all else, did not tolerate a mortal's gaze. She turned Actaeon into a deer, and his own dogs tore him to pieces. This cruel punishment shows how relentlessly Artemis defended her borders. The giant Orion, who boasted that he could kill all the animals on Earth, also met a cruel end when Artemis sent a scorpion to kill him. Even those who were close to her were not safe from her strictness. But Artemis could also be merciful.
Women invoked her during childbirth because she gave life and relieved pain as a patron goddess. She was a goddess who watched over transitions, the transition from childhood to maturity, the transition from life to death. Their power was not only destructive, but also preserving. It was the symbol of a power that dwells in nature itself, merciless to the weak who break rules, but at the same time generous to those who honor it. The Greeks closely associated Artemis with the moon, while her brother Apollo was equated with the sun. The silvery glow of the moonlight that lit up the woods was sacred to her. She was the companion of the night, the huntress among the stars, a goddess who radiated beauty and mystery at the same time. In its connection with the moon, there was also a reference to the cycles of nature, to growth and decay, to the interplay of darkness and light. Artemis was venerated in many places in Greece, but her sanctuary in Ephesus was particularly famous, where one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world stood, the Temple of Artemis. There she was worshipped in a form that emphasized less the huntress and more the mother and goddess of fertility, which shows how diverse and changeable her figure was. In Greece itself, she remained above all the virgin goddess of hunting, the patron saint of girls, the guardian of purity, and at the same time, the mistress of wild nature. Its significance for the Greeks also lay in the fact that it symbolized the uncontrollable. While Athena stood for reason and order, Artemis embodied freedom, wildness, the untamed. It was a reminder that nature is not only a source of food and life, but also a power to be respected and feared. In it, beauty was combined with austerity, gentleness with cruelty. Artemis was not the goddess of love, who gently guided hearts, but the goddess of purity, who punished every injury with unrelentless severity. She was the huntress who walked under the moonlight, the mistress of animals, the helper of women, and the protector of those who respected their laws. In the next chapter, we turn to her twin brother Apollo, who, as the god of the sun, music, and prophecy, was one of the most perfect and radiant figures of Olympus.
Chapter 14. Apollo, god of the sun, music, and prophecy. Apollo was one of the most radiant and multifaceted gods of the Greek pantheon, a god who embodied beauty, harmony, order, and deadly power at the same time. As the son of Zeus and Leto and twin brother of Artemis, he emerged from the beginning as a figure that ruled both in nature and in the human mind. Apollo was the god of light, music, poetry, healing, and prophecy, but he also carried the bow like his sister and could bring sickness and death. In it, opposites united to form an image of perfect harmony, and precisely for this reason it was regarded by the Greeks as an ideal of divine beauty and order. His birth on the island of Delos was an act of liberation because Hera had persecuted Leto and forbidden her to settle anywhere. Only the floating island gave her refuge. When Apollo was born, the island shone with splendor, and from then on, Delos was considered a sacred place. Even as a child, Apollo showed his power when he shot the Python, an ancient monster that guarded the Oracle of Delphi, with arrows and founded his own cult there. From that day on, Delphi was the center of his worship, and the oracle in which the Pythia proclaimed his words became one of the most important religious sites of the Greeks. Kings, generals, and simple people sought advice there, and Apollo's voice decided wars, journeys, and fates. Apollo was the god of measure, harmony, and clarity. He embodied light, not only that of the sun, but also that of the spirit. Philosophers saw in him the embodiment of the idea that all life follows an order, that harmony and moderation must triumph over chaos. At the same time, he was the god of the arts. With his lyre, which he received from Hermes, he led the muses, and in his playing lay the beauty of the cosmos itself. Poets and musicians called on him because they saw in his harmony the source of their inspiration. But Apollo was not only the god of art, but also the one who brought illness and death with bow and arrow.
A single shot could cover an entire army with plagues, as in the beginning of the Iliad, when Apollo punished the Greeks for the disgrace of one of his priests. Just as he could give healing, he could also bring ruin. This dual aspect made him a figure that evoked awe and fear in equal measure. Its beauty was legendary. Apollo was always portrayed in art and poetry as a youthful, flawless god, radiant like the sun, whose course was later identified with him. But behind this beauty, there were also passions and tragedies. His love stories often ended unhappily. The nymph Daphne fled from his persecution and was transformed into a laurel tree, which became his sacred symbol from then on. Hyacinthos, a handsome youth whom he loved, was slain by Odysseus, and from his blood grew the hyacinth, a flower of remembrance. These stories show Apollo not only as the god of beauty, but also as a victim of transience, as a figure who knew the suffering of unfulfilled love. His connection to prophecy was unique. In Delphi, the Pythia spoke, who uttered the words of the god in a trance, which were then interpreted by priests. These oracles were often enigmatic and ambiguous, but this was precisely where their truth lay, for they reflected the ambiguity of fate. Apollo was considered to be the one who had insight into the plan of the cosmos, but he never revealed it in full clarity. He left people room for doubt, and that is precisely why his oracle remained the most important voice in Greece for centuries. Apollo was also a god of sport and physical perfection. In his form, beauty of the mind was combined with beauty of the body. In many sanctuaries, games were dedicated to him, in which music and sport stood side by side. It was the ideal of harmony between body and soul, between art and strength, between light and shadow. His relationships with people were often characterized by strictness. He punished arrogance and disrespect with merciless severity. The singer Marsyas, who dared to challenge Apollo in a musical competition, was cruelly punished by being skinned alive. Niobe, the mother of many children, also mocked Leto because she only had 2 children. As punishment, Apollo and Artemis killed all their sons and daughters. Such stories made it clear that Apollo was not only the god of harmony, but also of relentless punishment when people overstepped their boundaries. Despite this harshness, Apollo remained an ideal for the Greeks. He was the god who brought order and beauty into the world, who touched the heart with his music, who illuminated the cosmos with his light, who showed people the way with his oracle. They saw in him the symbol of the longing that shaped Greek thought, the search for measure, for clarity, for harmony in a world full of chaos. In the next chapter, we turn to Hephaestus, the god of fire and blacksmithing, whose figure was not characterized by beauty, by toil and creativity, and who was nevertheless one of the most important creators in Olympus.
Chapter 15. Hephaestus, god of fire and blacksmithing. Hephaestus was the god of fire, blacksmithing, and craftsman, a figure who in many ways embodied the opposite of the radiant beauty of an Apollo. While many Olympian gods were depicted in youthful splendor or majestic dignity, Hephaestus appeared limping and of unsightly stature. But it was precisely in this contrast that his special greatness lay. For he was the creator of the mightiest works of Olympus, the one who produced miracles with fire and anvil that astonished even the immortals. Hephaestus' birth and childhood were marked by suffering. Some myths report that he was fathered by Hera alone to repay Zeus for the birth of Athena. However, when he was born deformed, his mother was ashamed and pushed him down from Olympus. He fell for days until he finally fell into the sea, where the nymphs Thetis and Eurynome rescued and raised him. In their care, he learned to forge and developed his skills until he finally returned to Olympus. Other traditions tell that Zeus threw him from Olympus because he sided with Hera in the dispute. In both versions, it is shown that Hephaestus was the outcast god, the weak among the powerful, and yet it was precisely out of this weakness that he grew into a source of divine power. As a blacksmith, Hephaestus was unsurpassed.
In his workshops, which were located deep inside volcanoes, he forged weapons, armor, and wondrous devices. The thunderbolt of Zeus, the trident of Poseidon, the helmet of Hades, which made the wearer invisible, all this came from his hand. The shield of Achilles, described by Homer with imperishable splendor, was also made by Hephaestus. In his works, he combined art and power, beauty and deadly power. He was the craftsman of Olympus, the creator without whom the rule of the gods would have been inconceivable. Despite his genius, Hephaestus was often the target of ridicule. His limp and his uncouth appearance made him an outsider figure among the gods. Hera married him to Aphrodite, the goddess of love, but this union was unhappy. Aphrodite turned to Ares, and the affair of the two was exposed by Hephaestus' cunning. He stretched an invisible net over the marriage bed in which he took the lovers captive and summoned the gods to mock them. But instead of standing triumphant, this revelation earned him nothing but ridicule, and his marriage remained humiliated. This story shows the tragedy of Hephaestus, the most skillful of all gods, but at the same time the one who came up short in love and reputation. But Hephaestus was not only a suffering god. There was a creative power in his art that made him indispensable. He built golden palaces for the gods. He forged self-acting servants out of gold to assist him in his workshop. And he gave mortals fire, which they used to forge tools and develop culture. His work connected heaven and earth, gods and men. Because wherever fire burned and metal was formed, Hephaestus was present. He was also a god who was important to ordinary people. While Zeus and Apollo were enthroned in the majestic distance, Hephaestus stood for work and effort, for craftsmanship and artistry. Blacksmiths, potters, and builders revered him because he understood their efforts and gave them divine inspiration. In him, they recognized that creation does not grow from splendor and lightness, but from sweat, from heat, from perseverance. The Greeks saw Hephaestus as a symbol of the value of work and technology. His figure reminded us that beauty and power do not always arise from external appearances, but often from inner power. He was not a warrior, not a ruler, not a god of love, but a craftsman, and yet there was a power in him that shaped the world. Hephaestus was a figure full of contrasts, rejected and yet indispensable, laughed at and yet admired, weak in body but strong in art. In it, suffering and greatness, pain and creation were united. Without his works, Olympus would have been defenseless. Without his hands, heroes would not have worn armor. Without his fire, people would not have developed culture. Hephaestus was a figure full of contrasts, rejected and yet indispensable, laughed at and yet admired, weak in body but strong in art. In it, suffering and greatness, pain and creation were united. Without his works, Olympus would have been defenseless. Without his hands, heroes would not have worn armor. Without his fire, people would not have developed culture. In the next chapter, we turn to Dionysus, the god of wine, ecstasy, and theater, a figure who embodied life in its exuberant lust, but also in its dangerous madness.
Chapter 16. Dionysus, god of wine and intoxication. Dionysus was the god of wine, intoxication, and ecstasy, a figure who embodied joy and terror at the same time. He was the son of Zeus and mortal Semele, and his very birth was shrouded in divine mystery. Hera, the jealous wife of Zeus, convinced Semele that Zeus should show himself to her in his true form. When he did this, it burned in the splendor of his divine appearance. But Zeus saved the unborn child by sewing it into his thigh until it was born. Thus, Dionysus became a god who was born twice. And already in this double origin, his ambivalent nature was reflected. He was at once divine and mortal, giver of life and destroyer, joy and danger. Dionysus brought wine to people, and with it the power to break through the barriers of everyday life. For the Greeks, wine was not just a drink, but a symbol of what freed man from his narrow existence.
In the intoxicating effect of wine, they saw a divine power that brought man closer to ecstasy and the divine. Dionysus was the god who broke the shackles of reason, who dissolved order and put man in a state in which he surpassed himself, be it in joy, in dance, in intoxication, or in madness. His festivals were wild, ecstatic celebrations in which women, the Maenads, paraded through forests and mountains in orgiastic enthusiasm, accompanied by satyrs with flutes and drums. In this state, the boundary between man and God seemed to be abolished. Nature itself was thrown into turmoil, and Dionysus was at the center of this frenzy. He was not the distant God of heaven, but the one who worked in the midst of man, who set them in motion, made them dance, led them out of the order of the palace into the freedom of the wilderness. But Dionysus was not only joy and celebration. His intoxication could be just as destructive. Those who resisted him experienced his relentless power. King Pentheus of Thebes, for example, refused to acknowledge the new god and mocked the shock of the Maenads. But Dionysus lured him to the mountains, where he was mauled by his own mother and the other women in a frenzy. This story shows the dark side of Dionysus. He destroyed those who did not acknowledge him, and his intoxication was as dangerous as it was liberating. Despite this threat, his cult spread throughout Greece. Dionysus was the god of the poor, of the outcasts, of those who could not find a place in the strict order of the palace. He gave them an experience that dissolved boundaries and promised unity. His worship was not just a celebration of wine, but a religious experience that made people feel part of a greater, divine reality. Theater, one of the greatest cultural achievements of the Greeks, was also closely linked to Dionysus. In his honor, the Dionysia took place in Athens, where poets performed their tragedies and comedies. The theater, like intoxication, was a suspension of reality, a transformation that led man into another world. Dionysus was therefore not only considered the god of wine, but also the god of masks, transformation, play, and art. In his vicinity, the boundaries between appearance and reality, between man and God, between life and death became blurred. His figure was as ambivalent as his power. Sometimes he appeared as a youthful, beautiful god with vines and ivy in his hair, sometimes as a bearded wild man surrounded by satyrs and maenads. This diversity reflected his nature. He was order and chaos at the same time, life and death, joy and terror. No other god embodied so much the experience that life is contradictory in its depth, that joy and pain are inseparable. Dionysus was a god who was close to people because he appealed to their longing for liberation, for ecstasy, for the transgression of all boundaries. But he also reminded them that in every transgression there is a danger, that intoxication not only inspires but also destroys. In him, the Greeks saw the truth of life, that it does not merge in uniformity and rigid order, but also in delirium, in passion, in dancing on the edge of the abyss. In the next chapter, we turn to Hestia again indirectly by leaving her role and continuing to look at the family of gods around Zeus' children. First and foremost, Hermes, Apollo, and Artemis, whose stories we have already heard. But now another powerful figure is in the spotlight. We had already met Hera's son Ares, and so the path leads us to another important deity. Chapter 17, Hades and Persephone, the mystery of death and return.
Chapter 17, Hades and Persephone, the mystery of death and return. The story of Hades and Persephone is one of the most impressive myths in the Greek world, because it is much more than just a story about a kidnapping. It reflects people's fears and hopes, their ideas of death and the possibility of return, of the change of seasons and of the eternal cycle of life. Hades, the lord of the underworld, was a figure of austerity and distance, a god who watched over the dead and showed no passion, until he saw Persephone, the daughter of Demeter. Persephone, who was also called Kor, was young, full of grace and of radiant beauty. One day, so the myth goes, she was picking flowers in a meadow, accompanied by her companions.
Suddenly the earth opened up, and Hades appeared in his black chariot drawn by dark horses. He seized Persephone and disappeared with her into the depths. This violent act shook not only her mother Demeter, but the whole world. Demeter, the goddess of fertility, wandered around desperately looking for her daughter, and in her pain made the earth barren. Fields withered, the harvest failed to materialize, and people suffered from hunger. Zeus, who watched over fate, could not stand idly by. He sent messengers of the gods to mediate, and finally a compromise was reached. Persephone was allowed to return to her mother, but because she had tasted the seeds of a pomegranate in the underworld, she was forever connected to Hades. From then on, her existence was divided. She spent part of the year with Demeter on earth, where she made the world bloom as core. The other part she had to stay at Hades' side in the underworld, where she ruled as Queen Persephone. For the Greeks, this myth was not only an explanation of the seasons. He was a symbol of the mystery of life and death, of the inescapable fact that all life passes, but also of the hope that new life will grow out of death. Spring with its blossom and summer with its abundance were associated with the return of Persephone, while autumn and winter symbolized the time of her absence, when the earth mourned and retired to sleep. Persephone was thus a figure who connected two worlds, the bright, cheerful earth and the dark, serious underworld. She was at once daughter and queen, girl and ruler, symbol of innocence and inevitable fate. Her dual role made her a mysterious figure who radiated both closeness and distance. Many Greeks saw in it the hope of a return of the soul, a premonition that death does not mean the final end. The cult of Demeter and Persephone found its expression in the Eleusinian mysteries, those mysterious rites that were among the most important religious celebrations in Greece. Those who took part in it experienced a ritual initiation that reenacted the suffering of Demeter and the return of Persephone. The participants believed that this experience would give them a glimpse into the mystery of death and the hope of continuing to live. Little is known about the exact sequence of these mysteries to this day, as silence was mandatory, but their effect was so strong that they attracted people from all walks of life for centuries. Hades himself is not portrayed in this story as a cruel demon, but as a god who demanded a companion. His kingdom was dark, but not evil. He was the judge, the watchman, the one who ensured order where no arbitrariness was allowed to prevail. Persephone brought light into his world, made him a ruler who was not only strict, but also bond. Together, they embodied the couple that inseparably linked death and life. The story of Hades and Persephone taught the Greeks that loss is part of life, that every blossom passes, that every joy is fleeting. But at the same time, she gave the hope that winter will be followed by spring, that even in the underworld there will be a power that brings forth new life. There was a deep wisdom in this myth that went far beyond religion. The realization that all becoming and passing away is a cycle from which no one can escape. Persephone thus became one of the most poignant figures in Greek mythology. She was not the goddess of radiant victory, not the ruler of weapons or oceans, but the silent queen who stood for the inevitable fate that awaits every human being, and for the hope that even in darkness a new light can arise. In the next chapter, we turn to Hecate, the mysterious goddess of magic and night, who reigned on the boundaries of light and darkness, and who, in the imagination of the Greeks, was associated with magic, ghosts, and transitions. Chapter 18. Hecate, goddess of magic and night. Hecate was one of the most mysterious figures in Greek mythology, a goddess who did not shine in the bright splendor of Olympus, but in the shadows, on the borders between light and darkness. She was the goddess of magic, ghosts, night, and transitions, a figure who walked through the dark world with torches and stood at crossroads where decisions were made. Unlike many other deities, Hecate was not limited to one area alone, but she worked in several spheres, in heaven, on earth, and in the underworld. This complexity made her a goddess who was both feared and revered because she embodied the unknown and unpredictable. Its origins go far back to the time of the Titans. She was the daughter of Asteria and Perseus and was not only spared by Zeus after the Battle of the Titans, but also endowed with special honors. While many Titan children were displaced, he allowed Hecate to retain her power. It was given dominion over heaven, earth, and sea, and could both give gifts and bring disaster to people. Her dual nature, as a benefactor and as a dark mistress, shaped her appearance from the very beginning. Hecate was particularly associated with sorcery, incantations, and secret rites. At night, the Greeks believed, she wandered around with a retinue of ghosts and dogs. Her howling announced her nearness, and at crossroads people sacrificed food to her to gain her protection or to secure her goodwill. These Hecate sacrifices often consisted of simple foods such as eggs, bread, or fish, which were laid down in the dark. No one dared to touch them again, for they belonged to the goddess and the spirits she accompanied. But Hecate was not only a horror figure. She was also considered a protector, especially for women and children. She stood by the women giving birth, helped the travelers, and guarded the front doors. Their torches were not only a symbol of the night, but also of protection, as they lit the way through the darkness. Her fascination lay in this ambivalence. She was the goddess who brought both protection and terror, who was far and near at the same time. Hecate was particularly closely connected to the underworld. She helped Persephone ascend from the depths and accompanied her to the surface, which is why she was revered in many cults alongside Demeter and Persephone. Their role was to guard the transition between life and death, between day and night, between security and danger. Those who honored Hecate were given the opportunity to pass safely through these thresholds, but those who disregarded them risked being lost in the shadows. Depictions of Hecate often show them in three forms, with three bodies or three faces looking in different directions. This image made visible that she stood at crossroads, that she could look into the past, present, and future at the same time, that she was the mistress of all directions and possibilities. Her torches and keys, her daggers and serpents enhanced the impression of a goddess who was both mysterious and powerful. The people saw in Hecate a figure who commanded powers that they neither fully understood nor could control. It stood for magic, for the invisible that eluded logic. In their cults, rituals were found that were associated with incantations, amulets, and spells. She was the goddess who was asked for help when it came to things that lay outside the ordinary world, be it love, death, or the knowledge of the future. Hecate's power was always a power of the border. She did not step into the radiant light like Apollo. She did not rule with thunder like Zeus. It worked in secret, in the places that people feared, and that was precisely where its significance lay. She reminded us that life is not only about clarity and order, but also about darkness, mystery, and uncertainty. In it, the Greeks recognized the necessity of also respecting the dark sides of existence. So Hecate remained a goddess of terror and hope at the same time, a companion in the night who both spread fear and provided protection. She was the mistress of magic, spirits, and transitions, and her mysterious nature fascinated people far beyond antiquity. In the next chapter, we turn to another ambivalent figure who both gave good and could bring destruction. Chapter 19, Pan, God of Nature, Shepherds, and Wild Lust. Chapter 19, Pan, God of Nature, Shepherds, and Wild Lust. Pan was the god of shepherds, herds, and untamed nature. He was not one of the exalted Olympians who ruled over heaven and earth, but was a rural god, deeply rooted in the forests, mountains, and meadows of Greece. His figure was half human, half animal. with horns on his head, a bearded face, a man's torso, and the legs and hooves of a billy goat. This hybrid form made him a symbol of the wild and original, a deity who stood closer to nature and the simple people than to the magnificent palaces of Olympus. His nature was full of contrasts. On the one hand, Pan was a cheerful, boisterous god who played his flute, which was later named after him, the Pan flute. He wandered through the woods, accompanied by nymphs, and filled the world with music that sounded sweet and wild at the same time. These sounds could awaken joy and lightness, but also spread fear and terror. For Pan was not only a god of lust and play, but also of the sudden fear that overcomes people in loneliness. From his name derives the word panic, that uncontrollable, irrational fear that takes hold of the heart for no apparent reason. The Greeks saw Pan as an embodiment of nature itself, beautiful and peaceful when it gave food to man, but also unpredictable and frightening when it showed its dark side. Shepherds worshipped him as a patron god because he protected their flocks and made them fruitful. At the same time, however, he was known for his unbridled sexuality. He chased nymphs, seduced women, and was considered a symbol of lust, which could be as creative as it was destructive. Many stories tell of how nymphs fled from him, and one of these stories even explains the origin of his flute. The nymph Syrinx, in order to escape his pursuits, changed herself into a reed. Pan cut off the stalks and tied them together, and so the instrument was created, the sound of which henceforth told of his longing. His cult was closely linked to the rural areas. Unlike the great Olympic festivals, which were celebrated in magnificent temples, Pan was worshipped in grottos, on mountains, and in forests. Especially in Arcadia, his homeland, he was an omnipresent god. He stood for the simplicity of life, for the rhythm of nature, for the closeness to the earth and animals. Shepherds brought him sacrifices in the form of milk, honey, or simple food to secure his favor. But Pan was not just a rural god. In later times, it was also associated with the Dionysian celebrations. His wild music, his exuberance, his lust, and his terror fit well with the ecstatic rites of Dionysus. He thus became the companion of the Maenads and Satyrs, a god who embodied the exuberant, compulsive side of life. Although he was often portrayed as ridiculous or grotesque, Pan was of great importance to the Greeks. In him, they saw what they did not find in Olympus, the original, wild, uncontrollable. It was the breath of the forest, the rustling of the leaves, the rustling of the wind in the trees, the laughter of nature, but also its cry that made people wince in the dark. The Romans adopted Pan in the form of Faunus, and even later he remained a symbol of nature and wildness. In him, joy was combined with fear, music with silence, lust with terror. He was not a god of cities or wars, but one who lurked at the borders of civilization and reminded people that, despite all their culture, they remained part of nature with all its untamed powers. So Pan was a god who carried the ambiguity of nature within him. It gave life and joy, it brought music and fertility, but it could also spread panic and plunge people into fear and terror. It revealed the truth that nature cannot be tamed, that it always carries something uncontrollable within it that fascinates and frightens at the same time. In the next chapter, we turn to the highest authority of Olympus. Chapter 20, Zeus, ruler of heaven and father of the gods, who stood above all others and whose decisions guided the fate of gods and humans. Chapter 20, Zeus, ruler of heaven and father of the gods. Zeus was the ruler of Olympus, the god of heaven and thunder, the father of gods and men. In him the supreme power of Greek mythology was united, and yet his figure was full of contradictions. He was the keeper of order and justice, the ruler of the world, the lightning thrower whose anger spread fear. At the same time, however, he was also a god full of passions, whose love affairs and intrigues often upset the fate of gods and men. His figure condensed the image of a ruler who encompasses everything: strength, justice, passion, and weakness. The story of Zeus began with a struggle for power. He was the son of Kronos and Rhea. Kronos, who himself had overthrown his father Uranus, feared that one of his children would deprive him of power and devoured them all as soon as he was born. Only Zeus escaped this fate because Rhea secretly hid him in Crete and gave Kronos a stone wrapped in swaddling clothes instead. When Zeus grew up, he forced Kronos to spit out his siblings again and led them to victory over the older generation of gods in the Titanic battle. With this triumph, his reign began, and he shared the world with his brothers. Poseidon received the sea, Hades the underworld, and Zeus himself took the heavens. As ruler of Olympus, Zeus watched over law and order. He was considered the protector of hospitality, the guardian of oaths, and a judge who inflicted punishments when people or gods broke divine law. His lightning bolt was the sign of his power, a symbol that struck anyone who defied his authority. But Zeus was not only the distant god of thunder, but also a shaper of fate, who was associated with the Moira, the goddesses of fate. Although even he could not always overturn their final judgment, he was the one who directed the course of the world and assigned the gods as well as the humans their place. His power was also reflected in the large number of his children. With goddesses, nymphs, and mortals, he fathered offspring who themselves became important figures. Athena, the goddess of wisdom, sprang out of his head. Apollo and Artemis were born of the Titan Leto. Hermes of Maia, Dionysus of Semele, Perseus, Heracles, and many other heroes came from his connections with mortal women. These stories show that Zeus was not only a ruler, but also a father, whose power continued in an incalculable number of children who populated the world. But his numerous love affairs repeatedly brought him into conflict with Hera, his wife and sister. Hera was the goddess of marriage and a powerful ruler, and her jealousy sparked countless disputes. She often persecuted the women Zeus had seduced and the children who came from them. These eternal disputes between Zeus and Hera were a mirror for human relationships: love and power, passion and strife, loyalty and betrayal. Despite all his weaknesses, Zeus remained the undisputed ruler. No one could oppose his authority. Even when he became entangled in passions or made mistakes, he was still the one who kept the cosmos in balance. He embodied the power necessary to tame chaos and the justice that brings order. Fate was in his hands, and even if he often seemed unpredictable, he was the guarantor that the world would not fall into darkness and anarchy. In art, Zeus was depicted as a majestic figure, enthroned with lightning and scepter, accompanied by eagles that symbolized his rule. He was not only the god of heaven, but also the symbol of royal dignity. For the Greeks, he was the highest being, who nevertheless bore human traits. They saw in him the image of a father, stern and powerful, but also full of passions that made him fallible. Zeus stood above them all, and yet he was not unapproachable. He was the embodiment of domination, but also a mirror of the human world. In him, the Greeks realized that power does not exist without weakness, that order is always threatened by passion, that even the highest ruler remains subject to the forces of fate. His greatness consisted in the fact that, despite all his faults, he remained the one who held the world together. So the journey through the world of the gods ends with Zeus, the thunderer, the ruler and father. His figure combined the diversity of myths, the power of nature, the longing for order, and the reality of human passions. He was the god who encompassed everything, the beginning and the end, the guarantor of the cosmos, and at the same time a figure in whom people recognized themselves, powerful in their dreams, weak in their desires, and yet inexorably part of a great eternal whole.